Welcome to Casual Friday. I'm going to give you an update on my 1930s vintage sweater and the progress that I've made on it in the past week. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the potential issues that I may end up having with this sweater that I kind of foresaw, but I didn't really know how they were going to play out. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the research I'm doing for my 1920s sweater, because I'm really fond of the fashions of the 1920s, and I've been taking a while to figure out what sweater I actually want to include as part of my overall march through the 20th century, because there are probably more than one 1920s sweater that I'm going to end up knitting eventually. Then I want to respond to a question that came up in the Ask Me Anything for Casual Fridays thread in my Ravelry group, which was asking me to talk about the relative advantages and disadvantages of cuff down socks versus toe up socks. So let's get started. So last week I had the back and the two fronts done. Well, 2 weeks ago I had the back and the two fronts done, and then I realized I needed to reknit it all and change the shaping. So I started out with because the pattern comes in one size. So I started out with what the pattern called for, and then I gradually increased to get the bust size I actually needed so that I could get that sort of more form-fitted look that the original pattern called for. So I'd reknit all of that. So this week I did the yoke, and then I knit the first sleeve. So the yoke, I'm really happy with how the yoke turned out. And I've had a few people who've seen it. I took it to my knitting group, and a few people have asked, how does that stitch pattern work? What's going on there? And what it is it's a knit one, purl one, ribbing all the way around. And then it's knit for about 6 or 7, I think about 7 rows. And then there is a plain row of just knit worked across on the right side, where you decrease 1 stitch out of every 4, excluding the button bands, so that you're eliminating 25% of the stitches. Because as the yoke gets wider, it needs to get narrower. So, and then you repeat the knit one, purl one ribbing, and so some of those ribs line up with the ribs from the first set, and some of them don't. And so it's kind of nice and interesting to see how you'll get this set of knit one, purl one ribbings going all the way up. Some of them do, and then you'll have some of the ones in between do not. Like you'll have 3 ribs here, 2 ribs here, and 1 there. And so that gets repeated, and it's really an interesting look. So again, you work the knit round where you do decreases, then 7 rounds of ribbing, and then you do another round of decreases, or a row of decreases, where you eliminate 1 out of every 3 stitches. So you're knit 1, knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together, all the way around. Again, you do your knit 1, purl 1 ribbing, and then before you do the garter edging here, you do another set of decreases where you eliminate 1 out of every 3 stitches. And that's how you get the yoke. And again, what I really like about this yoke is that it stays on the shoulder. It's not a yoke that comes down under the underarms. I don't like that. And so then the sleeves are set in sleeve. Now, one of the things I've talked about that I do before I start any project is I tend to chart it out or draw it out, make myself a schematic, because these old vintage patterns usually don't have any sort of schematic. And so I want to see what the shapes are. And when I had looked at the sleeve, I thought, this is really unusual. What is going on? And so I charted it out, and I'll put a picture of the chart up on the screen. So what you'll see is it starts out with ribbing, and then it goes straight for a while, and then you have, and it goes straight for quite a lot longer than you would normally see in a contemporary pattern. Contemporary patterns tend right after the ribbing, then they'll start regular increases all the way up until shortly before the underarm, and then it'll go straight to the underarm, and then you have your underarm bind-offs, and you have some sort of a sleeve cap. This one was not like that. You had some ribbing, and then you had, I think, three of these repeats where you're just knitting straight. So the arm continues to be straight, and then you get a section of gradual increases, and then it goes straight again until an inch or so before the underarm bind off, and then you'll get increases every right side row. Like there's this dramatic rate of increasing right before the underarm bind offs. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And then it has the bind offs, and then the sleeve cap seemed really long and narrow. And I thought, well, maybe this is just a distortion because my charting software defaults to having squares. And if I'm knitting in something like stockinette, those stitches are more rectangular shaped. So I changed the grid of my chart to make them more rectangular. And I still felt like, well, it looks a little odd. But I didn't know that it was actually wrong. Only one person has made this sweater before on Ravelry. And she made a couple of changes. She added more repeats to the body. I only added one extra repeat. I probably could have added two, but I wasn't 100% sure. I did had my husband take some measurements. I don't usually knit sweaters this short, and so I wasn't completely sure where I really wanted it to hit. And so we measured, and I thought, okay, one repeat should be enough. And this is before I knit the yoke, because I had to make that decision before it was time to bind off. So this other woman had knit additional repeats, but she, I think, had done what I had done, was whatever her chest measurement she needed, that's what she cast on for. And she got the blousing that I got the first time I knit this. And she said in her notes, if I were going to do this again, I would do it differently so that it has the shape of the original sweater. So she thought the sweater shaping was completely wrong, and she just kind of winged it based on her own experience and to do the sleeve differently. So I'd read her notes, and I agreed that it was an unusual shape for a sweater, but I wasn't really convinced that it was wrong. So what I decided to do was to go ahead and knit the first sleeve and then see how it fit into the armhole. And one of the reasons I wasn't convinced it was wrong, at least the shape of the sleeve cap, was because I looked at sort of the slope of the sleeve cap, and I calculated what the perimeter of the sleeve cap would be, and it seemed to match the perimeter of the actual armhole, which is what you want in a sleeve cap. You want those perimeters to match. In woven fabrics, you often want the sleeve cap to be a little bit larger and then ease in that extra so that your arm can move. But with knitted fabric, that's really not necessary. So let me show you what I think is supposed to be happening with this. It's hard to see in the knitted fabric. So the knitted fabric, you can see that the sleeve cap does extend up pretty long right here, and it's pretty narrow. When a sleeve cap is narrow and it's really fitted, it has to be longer in order for that perimeter to fit in the armhole. You can have a wider, shorter cap or a longer, narrower cap. Just depends on how things are supposed to fit. And then for the rest of the sleeve, because the edges are curling, it's hard to see, but you can see it's kind of straight up to this little point right before the bind offs, and then you get the angle there. And so that is the shaping that's really unusual. But when you look at the cap and how it's going to fit, the idea is for these horizontal bits right here to match up with each other. And I think that's part of the reason why this cap has to be so long and narrow, is in order for this diagonal edge to pretty much match the vertical edge of the sweater body. So I actually think it's going to fit in that shape. Whether it's going to feel comfortably, I don't know yet. But I am pretty confident that this sleeve is going to fit in there. But I didn't want to knit the second sleeve until I actually had seen what was going on with the first sleeve. One of the potential issues I thought might come up with this sweater is the fact that with a yoke sweater, you don't really have shoulder shaping. I mean, you sort of have the slope of the yoke right here to handle the shoulder shaping, but the back of the neck with this type of yoke sweater, see if you can see it in there. You see how it's kind of pulling up here? This is why normally we do shoulder shaping for sweaters. And with yoke sweaters, the ones that you see often that come all the way to the underarm, often there'll be some kind of short row shaping in the back to add length in the center so that you don't get this pull up. Because you need a sweater to kind of come down in the front, but it comes up higher in the back. So you need that difference. And yoke sweaters never really had that until the 1960s when Elizabeth Zimmerman started incorporating short row shaping into the back. And then nowadays it's pretty common, but it wasn't something that was done here. So this is something that I kind of anticipated could be an issue. But because of this really strong horizontal nature that the garter ridges produce, I didn't see a way really to add short row shaping that wouldn't be obvious that, oh, this stripe, this stripe is wider than the other ones. I didn't really see a good way to do that. So, and because I didn't really know how this kind of yoke was going to work and feel and everything, I wanted to knit it the way it was written and then see where any potential issues might be. So I tried this on, I took this to Knitting Group because I'd done with the first sleeve and I wasn't going to start the second one, but I took the pieces to Knitting Group, and another woman who's really interested in vintage knitting was asking me, what decade are you working on right now? So I was telling her and I was showing her the sweater, and she came over and looked at it, and I tried it on for her and I said, I think it's too short. And it's because this part back here pulls up a little bit because of the neck issue. And so I was like, I don't know how much I'm going to end up wearing it with this problem, and I certainly am not going to rip it out again and try to solve it. And again, the issue is really that there needs to be more knitting here, but it would have to be knitting that was filling in here that wasn't knit at the same time that this was knit because of how these parts were shaped. And I don't know how you could add short rows in here without it being really disruptive here. This is going to be something visually disruptive, regardless of whether you do something to counteract the pulling up or not. So I think if I were to use this sort of yoke, which I really like, if I were to use it in a new design of my own, I would make sure that the sweater body did not incorporate such a horizontal stitch pattern as what's going on here in order to be able to add some short row shaping to counteract that. But I think what I'm going to try is washing and blocking this first. First of all, this is wool, so it's going to be very amenable to blocking. And secondly, it's superwash wool, which is notorious for stretching out of shape and not coming back. So I think I can use that to my advantage in order to minimize what's going on up here in the upper back. So we'll see. So I'm going to put the sweater in, see how it looks. Then I'm going to wash, and I don't know if I'll wash and block before I do the second sleeve or not. If the first sleeve works okay, I might go ahead and do the second sleeve, or maybe I'll just wash and block it, and while it's drying, I'll knit the second sleeve. That might be what I do. And then again, I'd have to wash and block the second sleeve in order for it to all match. The sleeve, because it's so close fitting and I didn't really know how long an underarm seam I needed, I thought that I would be okay with the number of repeats that the sleeve called for. And because everything had to be lined up, I really wasn't sure how. I didn't think I needed a whole extra repeat. That would make the sleeve too long. I just didn't know. It's one of the problems with knitting a sleeve from the bottom up, is that if the things don't work out up here, you have to rip out so much in order to get it to work correctly. So I may be able to use, again, the characteristics of the superwash wool to help get a little bit extra length in the sleeve that I think I'm going to need. So this weekend, I am going to go look for buttons for this. So I really like the buttons that are in the original pattern, which are kind of an oblong shape. I really like that more than a totally circular shape. Now, whether I'll be able to find something like that, I don't know. But I really like that in the pattern photo. I kind of looked online to see if I could find buttons in that shape. And I saw some that were kind of oval shape, but not really sort of straight on the sides and then curved at the end, which is what I really liked. And then on Thursday, I will bring my vintage sweaters, my Edwardian sweater, my World War I sweater, and this 1930s sweater. I'm going to bring them to the Minnesota State Fair because I have a shift at the Minnesota Knitters Guild booth, which is in the Creative Activities building on the first day of the fair. I have a shift from 12:45 to I think it's 3 o'clock. We're supposed to bring our knitting, and anybody who wants to know anything about the guild or just about knitting in general, they can come up, we'll answer questions, and then we're always asked to bring projects to show people. So I am going to bring my vintage sweaters. So if you are in Minnesota and plan to be at the fair on the first day, I'll be in the Creative Activities building. There's like a central area where the Weavers Guild and the Knitters Guild, they have different like demonstration areas. It's off to the side a little ways away from where the knitting display is. Before that, I'll probably either be eating fair food or I'll be going around the knitting in the Creative Activities building and film that. I filmed it last year and I know a lot of you really loved it. I just love our state fair. I really think we have the biggest knitting competition of any state fair. And part of that is because we have one of the largest state fairs in the country. And we live in a northern climate where there are a lot of knitters. So it's really a competitive sport, the knitting in the Creative Activities building. Whether or not you're there on the first day, I would encourage you to go to the Creative Activities building and see all of the knitting. It's just amazing to see. So what I've been doing in the past couple of days is really doing some research on my 1920s vintage project. I kind of skipped the 20s to do the 30s because I knew what 1930s sweater I wanted. But there are a lot of choices for the 1920s that I really like. And I've been needing to evaluate them in a couple of ways. And I sort of set up some rules for myself when it comes to these vintage projects. After I knit the first sweater and I thought, well, I'm really enjoying this and I'm learning a lot from it, I set up some rules for myself, which obviously I can break because I made the rules. The first rule, though, is that it needs to be something that I want to wear because I don't want to do all this work and not wear that. I was willing to do that for the first sweater. And then my daughter decided she would wear it, which made me really happy. But because I decided I want to keep exploring vintage sweater patterns, I want to choose something that I know I will wear. The second rule is that there has to be something really interesting about the sweater that's going to hold my interest. There has to be something about it, not just that, oh, I would like to wear that sweater, but I want to learn something from it. So I want to pick out sweaters that have unusual or different construction methods, or have something unusual that, like this satin sleeve that is shaped, has such an unusual shape. Does that work? And why would they have done it that way versus how they do things today? Where you have just more regular increases all the way out. Why would they have done this kind of different shape? How they use techniques like short rows really interests me. How they use it for shaping and sort of the evolution of what technique that they used is really interesting to me. I want it to be something that's just interesting to knit as well. So I don't want anything too boring. So the 1930 sweater is mostly stockinette, but it does have that garter ridge, which kind of keeps me interested. And that yoke was really interesting. How it's all coming together, the sweater, the sleeve shape, everything about that is really interesting. And it's a pretty quick knit, which is a bonus as well. So another thing that I realized was important to me was that there's a challenge to overcome in getting through the knitting pattern, where maybe I don't understand the instructions, like I just can't figure out what they're saying. I can't visualize it. And I realized that that was really important to me when I was looking at World War I sweaters, because early on when I was exploring vintage sweaters, I heard about this book, Centenary Stitches, which was written in conjunction with a film about a family in England in World War I called Tell Them of Us. And so all of this knitwear was created by knitters all over the world. and they decided there really needs to be a book on this. And so one of the women involved runs Northern Lace Press. And so her job is writing patterns and doing books and all that thing. And so she took the patterns that they all had knit, and she graded them in multiple sizes. She had, modern knitting needles, modern yarns, and wrote the instructions in ways that a contemporary knitter could understand. And so when I was thinking about World War I sweaters, first I thought this, because there were a few things in here that I really liked. And then I thought, that's going to take the fun out of it for me, of interpreting the original pattern and making sense of it and figuring out what was meant to be done. So that became a new rule that I wasn't aware of, but it was something that, it was the whole thing that drove me knitting the first sweater, my Edwardian sweater, was because I could read the instructions, I could understand all the knitting instructions perfectly. It was the finishing instructions. I couldn't visualize what they were asking to be done. And so that was why I knit that first sweater, so that I thought, because what I have learned in my life, I'm a really experienced knitter, so I've knit a lot of different things and I can knit in my head pretty easily. But when I find that I cannot visualize what their pattern is calling for, it doesn't mean that the pattern is poorly written. So when I can't visualize something, that means I need to see it in order to understand it. That doesn't mean I need to see somebody else do it. It means I just need to see it happen. And so if I'm knitting it myself and I follow the instructions, a lot of times I realize what is happening as I see it, because I just can't visualize something I haven't seen before. So I can see it happening in my hands, and then I can understand it. So I knew that that would happen when I knit the Edwardian sweater, that somehow it would all become clear. In this case, it still wasn't 100% sure. Most of the time that will happen. So I realized that that was really what drove me to knit the first one. So I need some kind of a challenge in every sweater. With the World War I sweater, it really was pretty clear. From all the instructions were clear, except for the fact that the instructions for the collar were missing. And I had to kind of build the instructions and figure it out just from a single line that did make it into the pattern, and then work kind of backwards from that. And that was interesting and challenging. But when I have to figure it out for myself, I really have to think it through, and I think of multiple possibilities, and then I can try things out, and oh, that didn't work, or that did work. Well, it worked, but was it necessary? I can go through all these possibilities, and for me, that is really fun. It's not going to be fun for everyone, but for me, it's really fun. So one of the books I was looking through is this reproduction copy of Fleischer's Knitting and Crocheting Manual, and it's the 18th edition. One of the types of sweater styles that were really popular in the 1920s for a number of years was called a tuxedo sweater. It's an open front sweater, and it has a collar. It's like a shawl collar. It folds. It's the same, but it's not a shawl collar that gets narrower at a V-neck or anything. It's the same width all the way around, this flip back collar, and it comes down the front, knit in as part of the whole sweater. It's not attached later. And then you'll get some interesting striping patterns, whatever, in the body, but it has this fold back collar. And then belts were a big deal in these sweaters in the 1920s, and they're long because the 20s styles were long, and that just really appeals to me. And it in particular appeals to me because some of the pullover styles that were popular in the 1920s are styles that really aren't going to suit my body type. I've talked before about how women stopped wearing corsets during World War I because of the boning. They needed the steel to make ships. They didn't wear corsets in that there wasn't boning and lacing and stuff, but they still sometimes wore shapewear because there still was an ideal body that they wanted to conform to in order to be fashionable. And though that kind of shapewear may have had elastic in it, it may have been more like what we think of as a girdle now. But they did have shapewear, and in the 1920s, the ideal body was very boyish, and so they were strapping down their bosoms, and they were trying to contain their hips, and they really wanted this straight silhouette, and the clothing didn't have shape. It was very, very straight down, very loose, very shapeless. And it was interesting clothing, but it's very, very straight up and down. So some of the sweaters that I've been finding, I'm like, oh, that's a cute sweater. And it's 28 inches in circumference. And it goes down to the hips. that is never going to work. So I think a tuxedo sweater would be more in line with what would work for me in my body shape. So I've been really wanting to get the perfect tuxedo sweater. So I started looking through them, and I'm really reading through the instructions. And I don't know if it's true for all tuxedo sweaters, but the ones that I found in this book and some of the ones I found in other books, they're garter stitch, and they're very simply shaped. And there's absolutely nothing about them that's going to teach me anything, is what I figured out. Unless I can find something that's knit in a different sort of stitch pattern in a different way that has something interesting or unusual about it. The tuxedo sweater is in my future, but it's not going to be part of this particular march through the 20th century to learn techniques. So I realized, okay, I'm not going to probably be doing a tuxedo sweater right now. And I was at knitting group, and I didn't want to start my second sleeve of my sweater, and I had only brought this one book. So I started flipping through it, and I just decided to look at the men's sweaters. And normally I really don't care about the men's sweaters in the early 20th century, even through most of the 20th century. They're boring. Like, men's sweaters are boring. They tend to be plain stockinette, very, just nothing interesting about them. But there is something that I really like about men's sweaters in the early 20th century, and that is the shawl collar. I love a shawl collar. Contemporary sweaters often have shawl collars that have necks that are too wide, and they're just mostly decorative. They're not functional, but in the early 20th century, the necks were much narrower and the collars much thicker and more plush and more functional, and they are just something I really love. And I'd seen a boy's sweater, like a teenage boy's sweater, and I can't find the pattern book now, but it was in the early 1900s, and it had this kind of collar that I just loved. And I read through the instructions, and I could understand the knitting instructions for the collar up to a point. But I couldn't see where it was going. I didn't understand it. I tried to draw it out. It didn't make any sense to me. And I didn't know if the instructions were wrong or poorly written, or if this was a case of I have to actually knit this in order to understand it. And it was such a boring sweater that there's no way I'm going to knit a teenage boy's sweater in order to find out how that collar works. And so I kept looking, and there were shawl collars on women's sweaters. I knit my World War I serviceable sweater, had a nice shawl collar, but it was not of that type. So I was flipping through this Fleischer's book, not Fleischmann's, but Fleischer's book, and I found this sweater right here. And this is the type of shawl collar that I was wanting to do. And so I looked at this, and it's a cardigan. I love cardigans because even though I never unbutton them, I just really like cardigans with the buttons. And I was looking at the button band, and it looked like the whole thing is in stockinette. Like, it's a fold over button band. So you have to do 2 buttonholes. You need to do 2 buttonholes, and then it folds over, and then so the button goes through both holes. You have to line up those holes in some way. And I've never done a button band like that. I don't particularly like the way it looks here. I think they sewed their buttons on too tight, so the band looks kind of wavy. And it's got a hem, and it's got pockets, which I love. But it's got this collar that can be flipped up, and then they have extra buttons along here with little loops that you can really snuggle up under there. And so I was reading through it, and I was reading the collar instructions, and I thought, this is that same collar that was in that boy's sweater. And again, I couldn't figure it out. So I was drawing it. I cut it out of paper. I tried to understand it, and I couldn't understand it. So I spent all day Wednesday afternoon knitting the collar so I could understand it. And I still was having trouble. And finally now I understand what's going on. So I think I'm going to make the sweater, and I'll make it for myself. I asked my husband if he wanted it. He thought about it overnight. And he's like, I don't think I want that sweater. I'm like, that's fine. I'll take it for myself. I do understand how the collar works and the button bands. There are elements that you can clearly see in this photograph that are not mentioned at all in the pattern. It has a hemmed bottom. They don't mention hemming it. It has a pretty obvious ditch right next to the button band. And I thought, well, maybe that's from the seaming, but I don't know how you'd have to seam in order to get that kind of a ditch. And I realized it's probably a column of pearl stitches that creates that ditch and really delineates where that button band is. So I looked for some other men's sweaters, and I found a couple from the 1960s that have that same double buttonhole band and with a hemmed bottom, and they do have columns of pearls going up adjacent to the button band. And then the last thing that's really interesting about this pattern is it has the same sleeve shape as my 1930s sweater. It starts out with ribbing. The arm goes straight for a while, it gets wider, it goes straight, then it quickly gets larger before it binds off. But instead of having that long tapered sleeve cap, it's a pretty short, only a couple of inches, short and wide sleeve cap instead, which makes sense. If you don't have something that's long and narrow, then you need something that's short and wide. That sleeve in the 1930s sweater probably is not wrong. But it took looking at a men's 1920s sleeve to realize, oh, this is something that they used to do. I wonder why. So I was asked to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of cuff down socks versus toe up socks. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things where potentially there could be advantages or disadvantages. But really, it comes down to a matter of preference and knitting psychology. Preference of techniques and then your own knitting psychology. So let me talk about the specific situations in which one or the other might have an advantage. For toe-up socks, you do need a specialized cast-on and bind-off. You can't use your standard edge cast-on like a long-tail cast-on or cable cast-on or something. You have to use either a closed cast-on or a pinhole cast-on, depending on the type of toe that you're knitting. So you do have to have a specialized cast-on for that, and some people might find those a little tricky. On the other hand, some people find grafting the toe closed to be just a miserable experience, but there are alternative ways of grafting that don't involve the Kitchener stitch process. You can use a Finchley graft. You could do a 3-needle bind-off if you know how to do that. You could do a toe that doesn't require grafting at all, like a round toe where you can just fasten off stitches like you would for a hat. Any of those could be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on your perspective. At the top end of the cuff, if you're knitting cuff down, you can use just a standard cast on like the long tail cast on or any cast on that you would use to produce an edge. For toe up, at the bind off, you really can't use a standard bind off. It's not going to stretch enough. Now some people will say the long tail cast on doesn't stretch enough and they have to find a stretchier cast on method, or they've never been able to find a cast on that's stretchy enough to get past their heel or fit around their calf. If you're willing to go out and learn a new cast on, you could just learn how to use the cast on you already know and learn how to do it so that it is stretchy enough. Either way, you're going to have to learn something. You're either going to have to learn how to use your long tail cast on so that it's stretchy enough, or you're going to have to learn a stretchy bind off method that's different from the standard bind off. So it's a trade-off. Which one would you rather do? Some stitch patterns can be knit in either direction exactly the same and they look the same. Some stitch patterns, you just have to turn the chart upside down and knit it from the opposite direction, and then you'll get the appearance correct if you've changed the direction of your sock knitting. But there are some stitch patterns that just can't be reversed, and typically those are things like lace patterns where you can't just swap out yarn overs and decreases in a chart and expect it to look right. It doesn't work. So in that case, the directionality of the stitch pattern matters. But again, it doesn't mean that toe up is always better or cuff down is always better. It's dependent on that particular stitch pattern. So I do think that there may be a small advantage for cuff down over toe up when it comes to getting the length of the foot correct, because the foot is closed at both ends. Once you turn that corner, then the leg is open at the top. So if you happen to knit, if you're knitting cuff down and you happen to knit your heel a little bit too shallow or a little bit too long, then that extra fabric that you ended up with, if it was too long, will go up into the leg. Or if the heel was a little too short, then your sock leg can fill that in a little bit, as long as it's not too much of a fit issue for your heel. The sock leg will compensate for that because it's open at the end. So as you're knitting cuff down, as you head toward the toe, you can adjust the length of the toe as you're getting toward the very end of it, and you can try your sock on and you can see how exactly it's feeling, and you can adjust your decrease rate in order to get the sock exactly the length you need. If you're working toe up toward the heel and you discover that your heel is a little bit too long or too short, then you have to rip back at least to the beginning of the heel. If you have a gusset, you may have to rip back all the way to the gusset. So some of that's going to depend on how accurate your row gauge is, and knowing how many rows that your foot is actually going to end up. So you can control that if you pay attention to your row gauge and how long things are, and you can kind of control things a little bit that way. But that's the one situation in which if you end up making your foot a little bit too long, the extra length, it can't really go into the toe. It's just going to make the sock leg a little bit too long. So that's a situation where there may be potentially a little bit more of an advantage for cuff down than there is for toe up. There's an argument for toe up regarding the yardage that you have. So if you're worried that you're not going to have enough yarn to make a sock as big as you'd like, that you can divide the ball into 2 even balls, and then you can just, as long as you get past the heel and you're going up the leg, that you can just stop the sock whenever you run out of yarn. Or if you have plenty of yarn and you don't want to waste any of it, that you can just keep knitting your socks until you do run out of yarn. Now, for me, that's not really an advantage for a couple of reasons. One is that I want my sock leg to be a certain length. I would rather compromise on my sock toe and work a contrast toe than to sacrifice length in my sock leg. I live in a winter climate. I want my legs covered up. I don't want my pant leg coming up above my sock leg. But that's a concern and a preference that I have and not you. And then the other aspect where, while you can just keep knitting until you run out of yarn, I would then have to introduce leg shaping, and I'd end up with a sock that was sort of halfway up my calf, halfway up the calf muscle, and that is not where I want my sock leg to be either. So I only use 75 grams out of a 100 gram ball of sock yarn, so I know that I can, for myself, knit a sock as long as I need it and not worry about it. I do sometimes worry about running out of yarn when I knit for my brother, who has very large feet, but I have ways of dealing with that. One of the things I do for every project is I create a spreadsheet. I calculate the total number of stitches. If I'm concerned about the amount of yarn I have, I keep track of how far along I am at certain points so that I can predict how many stitches I can actually get out of a particular ball of yarn. I'll be able to know before I get to the heel, am I going to have to introduce contrast yarn somewhere, like in the toes, or if I do a peasant heel, I can come back and do the heels in a contrast yarn. So I can plan for that as I knit, and again, I can still get the length of leg that I want, which isn't something I want to compromise on. I'd rather compromise at the heel or the toe than compromise on leg length. So, but that's the way I would handle it. Some people, the idea of having to create a spreadsheet and calculating the total number of stitches in a sock sounds like the worst sort of torture for them. So there is no better way of handling these things. There's just the way that you like and the preferences that you have. For me, it really comes down to the knitting psychology of knitting cuff down versus toe up. And some of you are going to have a knitting psychology that's completely different than mine. If you wanted me to never knit another sock again, you would require me to knit 2 at a time, toe up on 2 circulars. That would stop me from ever knitting socks again. And yet some of you, that is going to be absolutely your preference for knitting socks. My preference is 1 at a time, cuff down. So on a magic loop. So we have these choices. Again, there's always multiple ways of getting to the same end point, but really there's no inherent advantage of one over the other. I tend to prefer getting the ribbing over with, doing the heel right at the time that I'm tired of knitting a plain stockinette leg. I really enjoy a heel flap and gusset and picking up stitches. Some people hate that. I really enjoy working my gusset decreases because I feel like I'm working faster and faster as I head toward the toe, and then the toe is getting smaller and smaller. So I feel like I'm speeding up as I head toward the toe. And if I were knitting toe up, I would be getting slower and slower. And in order to get a heel flap and gusset that looks the way I like, I would have to forfeit the picking up the stitches. Instead, I would have to be working a short row technique that would be creating the flap as I join with the gussets. And it's that I find super tedious. Of all of the heel choices, the short row heel is exactly the same toe up as cuff down, and it's the heel that I enjoy the least. It tends to be my last choice for heel. I would rather do a cuff down heel flap and gusset, or a peasant heel, again, cuff down and do the heel before I complete the toe. If I was going to knit that toe up, again, I'd have that issue with, well, how long is this heel actually going to be? Because sometimes I make changes in my shaping as I'm knitting the heel. And if I ended up with a foot that was longer than I intended, I'd have to take that toe out. So really it comes down to, is there something specific about this particular sock and the choices that you are making for this particular sock that would make a cuff down more advantageous or toe up? So for me, there's never been and never will be a situation in which toe up is going to be preferable for me over cuff down. But for a lot of you, that is totally your preference and always will be. You'll feel the opposite about the two processes that I feel. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.